Today I'm going to show you how to turn a desk or a vanity into two nightstands. I'd previously said that it's not as hard as you may think, but it is arduous of a task. It takes a while, and it's not necessarily as hard as you may think. I'm measuring here. I'm going to mark just on the other side to match each edge, which I'm going to cut off using a circular saw. You could use I'm using a track saw. You could use a circular saw. If all you have though is a jigsaw, you can do that as well. I've done it that way, and then you turn it at an angle, and you can then use sandpaper to smooth it out. You can use the jigsaw to cut straight down on either side and then angle on either side, so you have uniformity even if it doesn't look like the original piece. The first cut for me goes just fine, and then the second cut, it's going to bind because the first cut had the other side holding it up. If I had placed a block of wood in between where the desk's middle drawer went, it would have avoided that issue. And it wasn't a severe safety issue, but you don't want it to bind up, and so it did. Anyway, the jigsaw is what I'm going to use on the remainder of this, and you can use the jigsaw on the entirety of it. It's not as smooth of a cut, and it would take you a little longer, but you're probably going to need a jigsaw no matter what. The next step for me is going to be fighting the desk apart, and there's no delicate way to do it. You're just going to be in a fight with a desk if you do this. Maybe you'll get lucky. Sometimes they just fall apart. Other times it's a bit bigger of a problem. In case you're not interested in watching the entirety of the video, I'll go ahead and let you know how it plays out. After fighting the desk apart, I'll bring it inside, I'll remove the nails, and mark overhang that is there from the interior sides where the drawer had been, using a chisel as well as a handsaw. Following that, I'll replace the large missing holes. Wood that is salvaged from the piece will go into the large holes, and I will glue those down. Following that, I will trim places that are uneven in the overhang from the center where the drawer is, and that will be using a chisel as well as a hammer and a saw at some point. The large pieces of wood that I have salvaged will be glued, and then I'll use BONDO original body filler to get into the spaces where that glue wasn't. This shows 1947 manufacturing date. The pieces that I'll be salvaging are the ones I'm taking out, as you see right now. I'll need to trim them so that they're going to fit into the hole that I'm creating. And after that, when I glue them in, I'll use BONDO's original filler. Then I'll use a wood filler on top of that, and I'll sand both down to a smooth finish, at which point I will only need to use the router along the edges, or if you don't have a router, use the jigsaw at an angle plus sanding to create rounded off finishes. The time that's going to take is excessive, and this is a challenge, and I have tenacity. I welcome you to stay and watch it, and if you choose to do that, I'm going to talk about glue in a little more detail and the history of it, because it's so important to woodworking and furniture flipping, and the history is interesting to me, as well as body fillers. After taking them in, you see where those giant holes are. I'm going to replace those, and before I do that, you'll have a few minutes of history. Wood glue has taken on many different forms in the history of humans. Traditionally, animal proteins from milk or collagen from animal hides and bones have been boiled down to make glue. That was what the early glues were. They work by becoming solid as they dry. So evaporation, taking the water out, makes them solid. Down the road, glues would be made from plant starches, such as flour and potato. When the water is heated with the flour or potato starch, the starch becomes gelatinous and makes a sticky paste as it dries. As the water evaporates, it becomes sticky. Glues made from plant products were very commonly used in paper and books. The issue is that compared to animal-based glues, they can break down very easily over time. And so, until the 40s, most glues used in furniture remained hide glues. One of the modern wood glues is called polyvinyl acetate, also known as PVA, also just known as white glue. It's what we know of as glue. When you think of school glue, that's what you're thinking of. Polyvinyl acetate is essentially a number of different plastics that's suspended. The plastics tighten together and form a layer that's pretty tough to get around. It's glue. Things are glued together then. So when you put white glue on something, or wood glue, school glue, and wait, those plastics get closer and closer knit until you have a bond. PVA, or white glue as it's called, or craft glue, is not waterproof, but it is waterproof resistant when it's a type 2 PVA. Type 3 PVA is called aliphatic resin, or carpenter's glue, also called yellow glue. It's a synthetic adhesive that has a light yellow color. It's creamy in texture, and it is usually used to bond wood together. It doesn't have a strong odor. It's not flammable. The bonding strength is great. It is more heat and water resistant than typical white glue. Is a heavier in consistency, and it has some moisture resistance that PVA lacks up to a point. It sets faster than white glues, and so if you're using it in a complex project, that can be a bit of a challenge. After about 24 hours, it cures, and there can be a glue line because it has tendency to seep that'll be translucent or amber, which you can clean up before that even happens, which you'll see me doing with tap water. Just like you can with white glue. Unlike white glue, PVA 3 is heat resistant, and its hardness when it cures means that it can be sanded. Despite being able to be sanded, it can't be treated as though it is regular wood as far as the application of stain is concerned. The excess of the resin has to be sanded off or removed because it just will not stain the same way that wood does. The product that I use is Titebond, and Titebond comes in 3 types: the original, Titebond 2, and then Titebond 3. Those are all PVA glues. They're not hide glues. And the first original kind is for interior use only. It's not particularly water resistant. The Titebond 2 is water resistant, but not waterproof, and Titebond 3 is waterproof, or more than that, it's just incredibly water resistant. And the other difference is that with Titebond 3, you get 10 minutes of open working time rather than 5 minutes of open working time. In Titebond original and Titebond 2, you only have 5 minutes. Also, Titebond 3 is more expensive, not by some enormous degree, but it is more expensive. So while Titebond 3 can be applied to pretty much every project that you have in woodworking, because of costs, a lot of people will also stock themselves up with Titebond original and Titebond 2. If you're just starting out, I would recommend you go ahead and have Titebond 3. They'll get a small amount because it will apply to every project, and there's also, because it will. That's final recommendation. There you go. Titebond wood glues are safe to use. They don't have any harmful fumes according to the requirements that they meet. The ones that are Titebond 3 and Titebond 2 are also approved for indirect food contact. So it's one of the woods that may be recommended for creating a cutting board. The colors of the different Titebond glues when they dry is something worth looking up if you have an intention to have a really thick glue line, because it may affect the way your final product looks. You can do a single layer of glue before you do a glue up, or you can put a layer of glue on either side. Really, all it needs is to be wet still before it has that tacky. The tack time, as I said, for 3, you have about 10 open working minutes, and for 2, you have 5. That's true for the original as well. And as long as you are able to have a layer before that tack time onto your surface, then you can do either 1 layer or 2 layers. Doing 2 layers will create a thicker glue line, which may be something you're going for. But if it's not and you want to save glue, then just do 1. And then you can smooth it out with your finger or with whatever you want to make sure that there's not that much seepage, which is easy to clean up in original 2 or 3 with just some tap water. No problem at all. I found Titebond 3 to meet all of my needs perfectly well. What I'm going to do next on this piece, not mentioned earlier in the steps taken at the beginning of the video to turn something from dusk into vanity, is because it's not essential that you do this, is I'm going to be chalking off the legs on the front where I want to remove some of the detail because I'm looking for a more modern look. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to draw with chalk where I no longer want there to be pieces, and then I'm going to use razor blades to score the area. I'll be going back in with a jigsaw. Whether or not the razor scoring is necessary or not, that's up for debate. But I'm going to be removing the fronts now and then later on the sides as well, because the way the piece looks for me, it's going to need to have more clean lines. And after I chalk off the legs to have the front removed using the jigsaw, which I'll sand down, I'm also going to remove the metal on the bottom to replace with felt. I don't have all of the metal pieces that originally came with it, and I am quite sure that at least 2 of these pieces of metal that I chisel / hammer / just fight my way off, at least 2 of them are replacing originals. The felt will be just as good, and I'll also take this time to glue up some wood support that I see is falling off to such an extent on the feet that I should just go ahead and get that Titebond 3 out. And they're not sponsoring me. I feel like a commercial at this point. Next, let's talk a little bit about Bondo and just body fillers and wood fillers in general, what those are, how we use them, why we use them, advantages, disadvantages, etc., and so forth. Bondo is interesting for a number of reasons, not the least of which that it is commonly used in woodworking but was originally for automotive repair. The way that I use Bondo is it's a 2-part epoxy. So when you mix the 2 parts together, it starts hardening. As it comes, the Bondo, if you just took it out of the container and left alone, it's not going to get hard on its own. So what I do is something similar to a painter's palette. I plop as much Bondo as I think I'm going to need onto one part of the plate, and then the hardener I put a little bit on the other side of the plate. I'll mix as much as I think I can use in about 5 minutes at the same time, and part of what I do that for is because as you continue to work with it, it will start to stick to itself, and so the effect that you get is not as smooth. By taking out as much Bondo as I think I'm going to need and then having the hardener on the side to keep mixing together, I make sure that the product I'm working with is pretty smooth consistency. I like to use a putty knife that is flexible up to a point. There's specific plastic Bondo application spatulas. Spatula's not the right word, but something to that effect. And they're fine if that's what you want to use. What I like is the metal flexible putty knife. I had previously tried craft sticks, and it took me a while to figure out that the problem was not the Bondo, it was the application method on my part. Also, what I'll do with Bondo when using a flexible putty knife is I will cover the putty knife in tape, because removing it after it starts drying can really be a hassle. There have been times where I think in this video I'll forget to do that or won't do it initially and quickly learn. It's a way better practice for me in using Bondo with a flexible putty knife to have that putty knife covered in, I just use packing tape, and then when I'm done I can peel it off, and maybe there's a little bit to clean up left on the putty knife, but it's not the same kind of hassle that it is if I don't add that packing tape to it. The Bondo original is, as I said, traditionally for automotive body repair, which is to say that it is incredibly structurally integrous. It has integrity, whatever the word for that is. The integrity of it, the structural soundness is very high, and that's fantastic. It means that you can have pretty large chunks in a furniture that are missing, that you haven't filled with wood, that you can fill with Bondo without having any worry that it's not going to hold or have the kind of integrity that the rest of the material does. Bondo is actually probably going to be something of much higher integrity than plenty of wood. One of the disadvantages of Bondo, aside from the smell, is that sanding it after use is really pretty challenging. The way that I get around that is that I will use Bondo and have it just be slightly beneath the surface of where I want it to be, or where I want my surface to be. By doing that, it means that I'm not going to actually need to use the sander on that Bondo. I then, after allowing it to dry, read the instructions, they matter. After allowing it to dry for as long as is necessary, I will go back and I will add wood filler. In the case of this project, I'm going to be going back and using Bondo's 2-part wood filler. And that's also an epoxy filler, but it sands well. It is specifically designed for wood. And so I have 2 layers of different fillers. One is Bondo Original for automotive body repair, typically, that I do not have go much above the surface, and I don't have it go even at the surface. I keep it below where possible. Then, after that has adequate dry time, I go back with a wood filler, and after that has adequate dry time, I will sand it down. For me, this has been the best combination of the structural integrity of original Bondo and the sandability of wood filler. After sanded, I'm going to use the jigsaw again to cut the fronts off. And the way that I do it isn't going to be glamorous looking. It's a very rough cut, absolutely. I drop the camera at one point before I get to sanding the piece. And the sanding process really takes a long time. I'm going to be doing it at a pretty high speed, so it's not as long of a process for you. But keep in mind that if you decide to do this, sanding is going to be a huge part. I start with 100 grit sandpaper, and that takes off actually the majority of the wood filler. On this piece I did, for me, an impressive job of getting the Bondo just barely below the surface. But the sanding at the corners is a little more challenging because I'm using an orbital sander. I cannot get to the corners with it. That means I'm going to need to go in by hand. I use a block, which I cover with a 5-inch round piece of sandpaper. And if I could go back and talk to myself of the past, I would say, self of the past, spend more time here. Because the product that I'm going to end up with, there's some blemishes that are specifically in this corner due to me not sanding this section well enough. Nobody except for me, and now you, because I told you, will know that has happened, but it's just a note to self. After I do 80, I do 100, and then I do 220 220 is great for scuff sanding, and that's a lot of what I'm doing on this piece is I'm just scuffing up the surface for the paint that's going to adhere for me later. You can see the white dust, typical of lacquer that manufacturers put on it. This piece, like many, I can tell is going to have a lot of bleed through, and we're going to get a pretty good up close look at what that bleed through is in near real time shortly. At this point, I'm going to primer, and you could argue except for the routing of the top, I'm basically working with two different pieces now. This is no longer a desk. I have cut it in half, but the sides of one are entirely flat, where the sides of the other are just the original. You can see behind me the bleed through is already happening in so rapid a moment of life that I know shellac is going to need to be involved. This primer that I have, oh, click like, this primer that I have is to be laughed at for the moment because the bleed through, as you see, is pretty extreme. I wake up with my pajamas on, I come in with shellac. This is clear shellac. It's not a shellac-based primer. I'll have a shellac-based primer on other pieces, but this one, it's specifically shellac. I use that so that I can go back in with paint. And the paint that I use is going to be a chalk-based paint that is near turquoise. It's called Mint, I believe. And it's a lovely color, but not something I want on all of the work that I'm doing. I'm going to be mixing it with a brown that has kind of a clay in it. I use it for a number of things. You can see a picture there of the two before they're completely mixed. I think it would be good for a project where I do a pour. But I like the comparison to the drawer fronts on that. And so I do 3 different initial mixes for colors that I'm testing out to see what they're going to look like on the piece. The first one is going to be more green than I want for it to be. The second one, which you saw the combo where it kind of swirled, is one that I initially believed would be among my favorites. And then the third is a little too blue. The first one's a little too green. The third one is a little too blue. I'm going to end up combining the two of those in a ratio that will eventually be exactly what I want. At the moment, you see me here, I'm not sure, and I'm adding shellac, not because of the bleed through, but because shellac, after you tape, if you add shellac, then the tape has any gaps in it, the shellac will cover that gap. I'm using one of my favorite browns that has a clay kind of back color to it, in addition to that mint chalk paint without any changes to the color. This is going to be too extreme for me by a lot. And so I'll be changing that kind of clay brown and the very light turquoise to 2 more muted colors. The one on the left that I'm doing a second coat here is to give me a better idea of what those combos look like. I try for a third option that I believe is going to be somewhere in between the green on the left and the turquoise on the right, and then on the other half of the nightstand I will try that combination. Then I do a slightly different mix and decide this combination is going to be the one that I really, really love. In the moment that I'm doing it, how different one side, the right side, feels from the left side is pretty extreme. Later on, looking at it, they're almost identical. But I do know that the original mint is too much for me. The original clay brown is too much for me. And so the two of them, this is what I decide is good for the turquoise, and that middle tan color is going to be great for the body of the piece. I don't get all the way through what I want to before it's time for vacation, and that's a hard thing to be too upset about, though I did think about it a lot while on vacation. I use what colors I have to go back in, and do additional coats, and then I put one drawer in so I can see what I'm getting close to. I love what I'm getting close to and have decided the tan will be on the majority of the body, and then on one side of each piece where the inside where the drawer was, I'm going to have a triangle of turquoise. The panel there is just to give me ideas of different colors, and I've made my choices before it's time to leave, but I'm not quite done yet. If you want to stick around and see how these nightstands turn out, a few changes will be made. You're welcome to stick around. I admit, as of this recording, I'm not done yet. Come back. And if you'd like to see a video on how to make this Sausalito finish Pottery Barn style, I've got one of those for you.